Welcome, everyone, to episode 8 of The Argument Clinic. My name is Martin Sigalo, and your name is?
Lawrence So.
And we are with the Argument Clinic podcast, a Lincoln Douglas debate podcast for everyone, whether you're a seasoned veteran of the tournament scene, whether you're a lowly novice on your way to greatness, whether you're a coach of a local Maine debater, trapped in ice, or I guess no longer trapped in ice, because I don't know how cold Maine is at any point during the year. Whether you are Martin Sigalo listening to his own podcast to try to get better at debate, this is a podcast for you. And in addition to the normal lineup of Martin and Lawrence, you guys also get a special guest who we will introduce later on in the episode, and who you probably already know from looking at the description of the episode. But anyway, let's do the where in the world are Martin and Lawrence part of this. So, Lawrence, where have you been the last few weeks?
I actually have no clue where I've been the last few weeks. I think mostly just sitting in my apartment watching Netflix / studying for finals.
So when you say you have no idea, really you have a very particular idea.
It all blends together. The last 3 weeks have just been like nonstop Netflix. I recently discovered a program that lets you, a Google Chrome plugin that lets you watch Netflix at 2.5 or 3 speeds or whatever. So I've just been going through TV shows.
You madman. Why would you watch a Netflix show at 3 times speed? Oh my God. That's so great. Sort of. You're a degenerate. Okay, so I have been at 2 debate tournaments. I went to the Florida Novice State Tournament, where one of my debaters took home the trophy. Shout out to Parnica Agrawal. And I also went to the Tournament of Champions in Kentucky, where one of my debaters did not take down the trophy, but some very deserving debaters did. So really, really happy about how that tournament go to. And specific to Novice States, special shout out to Ethan Massa from Florida. Said that he was a avid listener of the podcast. So special shout out to you, Ethan.
We'd also like to thank Victory Briefs for sponsoring this podcast. Victory Briefs is a summer debate institute in Lincoln Douglas and public forum debate with locations at Swarthmore, Loyola Marymount, and UCLA this year. It features some of the best debate instruction in the nation and also provides high-quality briefs in LD and PF throughout the year. For more information, visit vbidebate.com.
If you have any questions about anything that we say during this episode, you should send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. And please do a good iTunes review for us so that we can climb the charts. We currently only have 1 iTunes review, and it would be great to have more. Okay, with that out of the way, this is a scholarship episode. And like our other topic analysis episode, we are going to really go deep into the CFL Nationals resolution about the right to know versus government need for secrecy. This topic looks amazing by anyone's standards, and if you were looking to compete at the CFL National Tournament, or you're just looking for a good way of understanding how experienced people break topics down and look at arguments and consume research, this is a good episode for you. And our special guest, who will also be going to the CFL National Tournament, like I will be, will have a lot of great perspectives on how to succeed at tournaments like this generally, and specifically on this topic. So this is a topic analysis episode. We're trying to learn all about the people's right to know and the government's need for secrecy right after this transition. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Hertzig. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm excellent. And how are you, Lawrence, if I haven't asked you that already?
Oh, I think I'm doing pretty well given the mental state that I'm in because it's finals week.
Mental state, finals week. I understand. I once had to do a finals week. Many of them. So Hertzig, you are a debate coach, right?
I am a debate coach. I'm the head coach at Harrison High School in New York.
Excellent. I believe we had one of your students on here in the past, Catherine Kenny.
Yes, you did. She was on a while ago. Yeah.
So you have some experience at this tournament specifically, the CFL national tournament, right? I know personally that the last time like Lake Highland did well at that tournament was like, I don't know, like my junior year of high school or something. So Lake Highland has not had a particularly stellar track record at that tournament, but you, I gather, have had some very successful students.
I guess so. I've had kind of a weird history with CFLs. I actually won CFLs when I was a debater
Whoa, no way. That's so cool.
In 1998. And in 2014, one of my debaters, Danny Dubois, won the tournament as well in LD. And I've had some successful debaters there, or I've had some debaters be successful there over the past few years on occasion, but I've also had years that didn't go as well. So I definitely have had a mixed record at CFLs, I would say.
Yeah, our record is mixed, but much lower as well. So. Okay, so I reached out to you to do the podcast because you were actually going to the CFL National Tournament this year. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Yes. So I am as well. So we have two people who are going, and then Lawrence, who will presumably root from the sidelines.
I may or may not be at a gathering of Asian people that weekend, but sure, I'll be rooting from the sidelines.
From the comfort of your childhood home, perhaps?
I actually believe that these Asian people are renting out a cabin somewhere out in the woods. So, we'll see how the cheering from the sidelines goes.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get right into the nitty-gritty. So first things first, let's talk about the resolution. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to give you the text of the resolution a couple times so you guys can have it in your mind. And then we're going to break the resolution down piece by piece. We're going to go piece by piece through the resolution, pick apart each term so that you guys have a good enough understanding of everything that we need to talk about. And then in the next two sections after this, we're going to discuss strategy as well as some specific case positions to get for and against. Okay, so let's start it out. The resolution is, Lawrence, would you like to read the resolution for us?
Tough task, but I'll see if I can manage. The people's right to know ought to be valued above the government's need to secrecy.
For secrecy, right?
Oh, for secrecy. I'm sorry. As I said, it was a tough task.
9 out of 10, 9 out of 10. So the people's right to know ought to be valued above the government's need for secrecy. Okay, so let's go through this piece by piece. So the people. Hertzig, when you hear the people in a resolution, what are the sorts of things that you normally think about? What is the people normally about?
Well, I think the people, the most intuitive interpretation for me is just the citizens of that society. Taxpayers, people who are residents of that area. I think that there are potentially other individuals or groups of individuals who could count as the people, but in my mind, the immediate definition would be, or the immediate sort of term that comes to mind is the public or the general public.
Okay, so two questions that maybe both of you can help me with here. So the first one I'll direct to Lawrence. So importantly, the resolution says that people's right to know ought to be valued above the government's need for secrecy. And we've had a lot of resolutions in the past couple topics that have had a United States somewhere in there. So this resolution doesn't have that. So the people here, correct me if I'm wrong, Lawrence, refers to the peoples of all of the societies, or at least a lot of them, and not just the United States. How is debating United States topics different from debating non-United States topics?
So for me, I guess the biggest difference is that I experienced when I was debating topics specific to the United States, like the 2014 Nationals topic my senior year, was that there was just a lot less Constitution arguments. And that to me is like the single biggest difference, because I just heard tons of the Constitution says X, Y, Z on both sides of the topic, whereas I think this one pulls it away from sort of specific legal documents like the Constitution and brings it back into a debate about sort of general moral principles that guide a hypothetical just government.
That's a good point that I had sort of thought about as an issue, but didn't really realize, I guess, how major of an issue that it would be. Maybe I just underestimate Constitution arguments.
I debated a Constitution argument in semifinals of nationals, actually. So it was a very prevalent argument. And I think that because it's not US specific, that gets rid of what I perceive to not be a great argument in sort of a moral philosophy debate about the role of a hypothetical just government.
That's fair. Hertzig, do you have anything to add to that or any additional wisdom for us on United States versus non-United States specific resolutions?
Yeah, well, I think that on the one hand, I agree with Lawrence that it does remove the ability of debaters to just cite the Constitution and make that an argument, because I think that often falls into sort of fallacies. But I think at the same time, setting it in the United States would be helpful just because there's a specific legal and political context for the topic there that doesn't exist anymore. So when you don't have that, I think it's much harder to figure out, what the topic is really about, because there are lots of assumptions that you might make if we were talking about the U.S. In terms of divisions of power at the federal level, or in terms of checks that exist on government that you can't make when you don't know which government we're talking about. So I think in a way it makes the topic a little more difficult to debate when you don't have that context.
That's definitely true. And a lot of articles, I can testify to this, on this resolution come from law reviews. Right. And a lot of those kind of assume a United States focus to that.
Yeah, and like even outside of that specific legal and political context, a lot of the articles that defend the need for secrecy reference very specific circumstances of the modern world, and specifically the United States, as it relates to things like surveillance, terrorism, crime, diseases, etc. So I also think that the lack of context with the United States also sort of branches out into that area as well, not just the legal and political context and references to a structure of government, legal tradition, etc.
That's a good point. And speaking of good points, the second good point that I'd like to bring up about the people here is that, just a little less important than the United States stuff, but worth noting. So this stuff about the people, referring to like the citizens of a country. So correct me if I'm wrong. It would not be topical for the affirmative to make arguments that like the people in Germany deserve to know United States surveillance. Like people in one country's right to know, like the right to know for the people in the resolution have to be the same, people, quote unquote, or the same government that the secrecy is about, right?
I think that
am I being unclear?
I definitely see what you're saying. Yeah, I think that makes the most sense, and I think that reading of the topic is probably the one that's most intuitive. So I agree with that. I don't think the topic itself necessarily puts that limit there, but since this is CFLs and not a typical sort of circuit tournament, I think that your reading of the resolution is going to be the more common one. I also think that, and this gets into something we might get into later, but the use of the words right to know is important because it raises the question of, whether people in one state do have a right to know information that's being kept hidden by another government. So I'm not sure that they do. So I think that probably your reading of the topic makes the most sense.
Yeah, although, it is sort of interesting that I think that this debate will kind of become moot in a lot of cases anyway, especially because like if the United States citizens like demanded to know information about the United States government, like I guess everyone would have it theoretically, right? If the information gets out there, like if United States citizens know it, like it's just on the internet, like a couple seconds. But yeah, it is a slightly interesting question whether like other citizens can like demand stuff from the U.S. government.
Right. Mhm.
I mean, it would probably make being affirming a little harder, because the negative could be like, so your argument is that like, Afghanistan should be able to subpoena the United States for like drone locations. Like
Mm.
that would be that would take the national security argument to kind of the next level.
Yeah,
Would
definitely.
be a little weird. So you mentioned the right to know. Conveniently, the next words in the resolution. So the right to know. My understanding of the right to know is that it's when people talk about whether or not people in a certain country kind of like deserve to know or are able to, through the courts, acquire a certain information about governments. So the right to know, and correct me if I'm wrong, this isn't like people say that people have quote unquote a right to know, but it isn't like in any law anywhere, like in countries, right? That people have rights to know things.
Yeah, I don't think there's an explicit right to know, or at least that rhetoric isn't used. I don't think that language isn't used, but I do think that there is a right to acquire certain information at times. So the public, the people have a right to particular, types of information that maybe the government wants to classify. I feel that the topic is asking about issues that people are entitled to find out about, even if they've been classified by the government.
Yeah. So I actually had a question about the resolution, and specifically about the right to know part of the resolution. So, one quick thing before I say that, those of you that search right to know on stuff like Google, or maybe just search right to know, you'll start finding some stuff about like medical information, about like the right to know your what disease you really have, or like the right to know your genetics or whatever, right? Just want to be clear, right, Lawrence? Like that's not what the resolution's about.
Yeah, because like there is a right to know in like commonplace workplace and like environmental law. Like you have the right to know like what chemicals you're exposed to, I think, in the workplace and stuff, which isn't the topic here.
Right, because it has nothing to do with the government, right? It's not like the the right to know stuff from your doctor at all compromises government need for secrecy. So
yeah,
it's not about that. Okay, so back into kind of the thick of this. So those of you that have done research on the resolution already will know that a lot of the topic literature on a resolution like this talks about freedom of information laws, and there are tons of laws around the world, and a lot of these laws are kind of the same because they were copied from US and UK laws, and they basically say you as the citizen have the freedom, you could say right, to know certain things, and you can kind of, you or civil society groups like non-governmental organizations can like file like legal proceedings in order to make the government give up classified information, as Hertzig said. So my question is, are there going to be some people at this tournament, or Hertzig, do you think that this is like a thing that, is a reasonable thing to say, that freedom of information laws are actually not about the resolution because they're not about like actually having rights to information?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. I don't know the answer to that, because I think, on the one hand, I definitely think that freedom of information is related to the right to know and is really how we implement the right to know. On the other hand, that seems to be about a freedom to find out information as opposed to a right to know. And I don't know if those two things are the same or not. I personally think that they're similar enough that you could probably make arguments related to freedom of information laws and be fine, but they're not exactly the same.
Yeah. So one important thing to think about, Lawrence. So like for a right, normally like in order to call something a really like a right in the United States, right? that has to be enforceable by the courts. Like in order for you to like have a right, quote unquote, like the courts have to be able to say like you like deserve this or whatever. And the point is that, you know, these freedom of information laws, they don't do that, right? They don't, I think, right? Like they aren't like, you know, constitutional law or whatever. Maybe they're statutory law. Maybe that's good enough. I guess statutes give people rights. I mean,
I'm not a legal expert, so, but as I think I would most likely just agree with Hertzig here and say that, you know, regardless of the technicalities of the Freedom of Information Act and whether or not it's like a right or whatnot, it's similar enough that for the purpose of this debate, I think we can kind of ignore those minute details.
Yeah, I do think that one thing that makes it tricky, just makes the wording a little tricky, is that freedom of information seems to be a type of negative liberty, meaning that the state cannot prevent you from discovering or uncovering certain information. You know, if you seek that information, then you are entitled to get that information. And it's not clear from the wording of the topic whether the right to know is a similar type of negative right where the state can't interfere with your ability to obtain information, or whether it's some kind of positive right where the state has an active duty to provide you with information. But yeah, I just think that, you know, that issue is a little bit difficult to resolve, because I'm not sure when they say right to know which of those two things they mean.
Well, yeah, so I also think that there's another way to phrase it as sort of a negative right, which is that there are some people that write about the right to know, or more accurately, more like critiques of secrecy, which isn't a statement about you have a proactive right to know, but rather that the government has a very limited power to suppress the freedom of speech of government employees who do know these things. And it potentially could be phrased as a negative right for government employees, which is like that you can't stop them from telling people about most things that the government is doing. So I think that's another way to think about this right as well.
Yeah, I guess in some specific cases, it's a little more obvious. But, you know, generally, it can be a little difficult. Okay, so just before we move on to other words in the resolution, just some background information very quickly about like freedom of information laws. So tons of countries have freedom of information laws. Like there's so many of them. And because of that, there is tons of scholarly research. There is a whole field of scholarly research dedicated to freedom of information laws and whether or not they work, whether or not they're good. And there's about 30 years of research data on that. So this is a very thriving field. A lot of people have written articles about this. There was kind of a turn to transparency in democracy promotion efforts just in the like 80s, 90s. Someone called it in an article I read, like, you know, the new decade of transparency, where it was like the new hot thing to just like get a freedom of information law. But that doesn't mean that, you know, they're necessarily good. It just means that a lot of countries have them. So there is a lot of research on this. Things that have been helpful in my research when I'm looking up things about the information. Obviously, the right to know will get you some stuff that you want, and secrecy will get you some stuff that you want. But also I found looking up stuff about transparency is really good, like the concept of transparency, openness, and specifically freedom of information laws. I found those things to have been particularly helpful when researching the right to know. I get good articles about that. Do either of you all have any like particularly maybe non-intuitive search terms that you maybe recommend using for stuff like this?
Yeah, one that I've used a lot is the term overclassification, just as one word. I've seen a lot come up if you just search for that. Usually that's affirmative evidence, but it does yield a lot. And then just terms that are related to transparency, like accountability, checks and balances, democracy. If you type in those terms with secrecy, right to know, freedom of information, you know, those types of related terms, you'll get a lot of articles. And I've seen a lot just by typing in one of those related words with one of the terms in the resolution.
Ooh, okay, awesome. So to just restate, Overclassification is a term that you'd recommend, and then also terms like accountability, checks and balances, and then you add secrecy in with that. And those are good
Right.
suggestions.
Right.
Okay, good stuff. I definitely had not found overclassification. So that's very interesting. Okay, so all right, this was the easy part. So next word in the resolution is ought. We've been there and done that. We've had tons of ought resolutions. Hertzig, do you think that CFL Nats, I mean, it doesn't really change what the definition of ought really should be. It should just be moral obligation basically 100% of the time, right?
Yeah, I have to say I haven't seen a lot of rounds at CFLs come down to ought. I think that, people generally, in my experience, judging there and coaching there, people generally sort of accept that it means something related to either a moral obligation or just general desirability. But I haven't seen it become a big issue in the past.
Me neither. But the point is that we shouldn't try anything crazy with this. We should just kind of just do what we've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just as a general rule,
yeah,
it's good to avoid anything that's a little too wild. The tournament tends to be quite traditional and pretty straightforward. And so I find that when I see debaters trying things that aren't intuitive, they generally don't do as well at that tournament.
Definitely true. Okay, so ought to be valued above. So, Lawrence, I assume that by valued above, it means physically higher.
Yes. In my long history as a debate coach, I believe that is the most reasonable interpretation of what valued above is supposed to mean.
Just elevated.
Yeah.
Just above the earth. So we should just take our right to know document or whatever and just place it on a really tall mountain.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, just kidding. So valued above really means prioritize, right? It means you've got two things. If you value something above something else, you prioritize it when they're in conflict. And this is a kind of very important point. So the resolution only happens when there's a conflict between secrecy and the right to know, right? Right, Lawrence?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't say when in conflict, like some of the previous topics that are similar to this have occurred, but I think it's pretty easy to assume that the clash in this topic comes from when they trade off with one another in some form or fashion.
Lawrence and Hertzig, do you want to hear a real argument that I made at the CFL National Tournament my sophomore year?
Yes.
It'll probably make me sad.
The resolution said when in conflict, and then something that I don't remember. And I made the argument in my last negative debate that when in conflict meant when we are in a war.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that was excellent. I was pretty convinced that I was right, but the three judges and my opponent were not so convinced. Oh wow. I was really frisky back in my youth. So yes, when in conflict, good thing that unclarity is out of the resolution. Instead, we have valued above. So here's the key thing about topics. So I haven't debated really prioritize X over Y topics very often, despite the fact that it seems to be the NSD Nationals topic every single year. I really didn't debate them that often. So maybe one of the things that was counterintuitive to me, and maybe it will be to some of the listeners that haven't debated topics like this. So it seems to be like on normal resolutions, right? You're saying X thing versus Y thing. And your argument is X thing is the best, Y thing is the worst. They're just always I want 0 of the Y thing. And I want 100% of the X thing. And when you're on the neg, you say the opposite. But, in this, on topics like this, correct me if I'm wrong, really, when you're affirmative or whether you're negative, really, you're just trying to say, I want 60% of this and 40% of this, not 100 and 0. You don't have to completely reject one of the things. When you're affirmative, you don't need to say secrecy always bad 100% of the time. You could just be like, secrecy, good sometimes, but most of the time not.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you pointed that out, actually, because I think one of the problems that people often have on topics like these, and I see this often at tournaments like NCFL or NSDA nationals, is that they assume that it is all or nothing, and they make arguments just for why their object of evaluation, their side of the resolution, is a good thing, rather than assessing the conflict between them. Yeah, I think that the topic is meant, in my view, the topic is meant to look at sort of holistically, where do you want the balance to fall? Do you want it to be more on the side of the right to know, or more on the side of secrecy? And so I think that you really want to move away from the extremes of, what would happen in a world with no government secrecy or no people's right to know. And you want to find the middle ground, which is a little hard. It's hard to articulate kind of what the bright line is for like how much secrecy you would have or how much of the right to know you would have. But it is somewhere in the middle, with more of the balance tipping in favor of one side or the other.
So yeah, in like terms of public policy too, I mean, like no one who is, advocating for more right to know because, they're like an ACLU lawyer or something like that has ever just gone out and said, yeah, the government should get eliminated secrecy. Instead, when they propose, policies to sort of value the right to know above the government's need for secrecy, it's always just like err in favor of the right to know. And when people are writing in favor of the need for secrecy for the purposes of national security, they're not saying it always trumps the right to know. It's just saying we should err in favor of a need for secrecy. And I feel like this is one of the only topics where it has a valued above statement, and the literature is actually very much the middle ground with just a little bit of difference on each side. Whereas like some of the other topics, like maybe the NSDA topic for nationals this year, has a lot more people that are extreme on either side. Like, yes, liberty, like get rid of national security as a primary goal, or vice versa. And I think this topic's literature is much more reflective of the balanced sliding scale as opposed to all or nothing approach.
I definitely agree with your evaluation of the literature. There is just a tons of literature about how you would go about balancing those two things, about like secrecy versus right to know and transparency. So many people say, hey, there's a balance, let's try to like adjudicate between them. Some people say, hey, finding that balance is really hard, maybe it's infeasible. And some people say the balance should tip to one side. Some people say it should tip to the other. I think it will create a lot of really interesting debates. And there are two things that I like about resolutions, like with valued above in them specifically. One is that it forces debaters away from the margins. And as I'm sure you both can attest to, debaters just love to just take the extreme position on, a lot of resolutions, right? They're like, hate speech is the worst. It's impossible to come back from that. We'll be completely debilitated. Versus like, hate speech not even a thing. Like, minorities feel no pain, right? It's just like, I feel like the true thing and what people actually think is in the middle so often. And I really like that this resolution allows us to play to the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think also for debaters who are more accustomed to national circuit debate than to traditional debate, it can be a little bit difficult to make that transition for that reason, which is kind of what you're saying, that in circuit debate, there is an emphasis, I find, on the extremes. And there's such a movement away from what I would call reasonable positions. So I think one thing I really like about this tournament and this topic is that you can't really do a lot of that extreme debating, and you do have to find sort of a defensible middle ground position.
Okay, so I'm going to seize on something that you said there. You said debaters will have to do this. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is the way that you would force a debater's arguments to be like this. So let's say the negative talks about the national security exception. And as we'll talk about when we get into negative positions, they're just like, there should be an exception for national security, or it's important for national security for like a lot of detailed military plans, like to be classified. Correct me if I'm wrong. Your point is just that the affirmative can just say to that, you've not actually negated the resolution. I can agree with you, right? that there should be a national security exception. That doesn't mean that in general we shouldn't value this over this.
Right, exactly. Just as we have, to go back to the free speech example, the classic falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater example, right? We have an exception to free speech when people are using it to endanger others, but that doesn't mean that we don't value free speech more in general than other, concerns. So I think it's a similar type of argument that there can be exceptions to the public's right to know, but that doesn't mean that we don't err on the side of declassification.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, definitely true. And the second thing that I wanted to bring up was, it is good that this resolution, like, that the conflict between these two things, right, the right to know and secrecy, it's good to know, it's good that at least the conflict is obvious. Like, it seems that, like, more secrecy, like, less transparency as kind of like a linear matter, which at least makes the conflict kind of like sensible and not like I found that, like, on resolutions like this that are too disjointed, when they're comparing the conflict of two things that don't conflict very often, it just can become very awkward. Like, the type of debates you have just become very small.
Yeah, and I think those types of topics also just become very abstract and kind of weird, because it seems like, and I don't know why I can't think of a specific example of one right now, but I know what type of topic you're talking about. I feel like on those topics, you end up trying to compare the two objects of evaluation in a vacuum because they don't conflict often. So I agree. I think there's sort of a disproportionate relationship, proportional, disproportional, I don't know, but where you have more of the right to know and less secrecy, or the other way around.
Yeah, maybe like inversely proportional. Maybe?
That is what I was looking for. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that's enough time on valued above. Now, so the government is the next phrase. This one's easy. The only important thing is that it doesn't really say the United States. And another very quick thing to talk about is that, the governments that have secrets are all sorts, which include, maybe places that are less democratic than we would like, or at least the resolution applies to those countries. Now, a lot of those countries don't tend to have freedom of information laws, but some of them do. And the important thing to realize is that, like, maybe we shouldn't assume, like, a democracy kind of like to start out.
Yeah.
At least as a political system.
Yeah, I think something that makes the topic a little tricky is the fact that we don't know what type of political system it is, and that can impact the type of information that would be hidden from the people. So I think, if you're in a society where you don't have a lot of free speech, or you don't have a free press, it can be, the right to know can be much more significant than in a democratic society where some of the information is going to come out anyway. So I think one thing that makes the topic a little hard to debate, we were talking earlier about the lack of context, and I think the fact that you don't know what type of political system you're in does make it hard to know how much you need the right to know.
Now, that's true, but and maybe you could help me with this, Lawrence. Even though we don't know, like, what kind of place what kind of exact political system we're dealing with here, there are a lot of arguments kind of for democracy in a philosophical area. Like, a lot of the arguments for, like, checks and balances and accountability to governments would kind of imply that even non-democracies or countries that aren't super democratic should have checks and balances and accountability. So I guess I to word my question in a way that makes sense as an actual question, even though a lot of countries aren't democracies, do you think it's still possible to use kind of like the ideals of democracy, like accountability and whatever, to craft affirmative cases?
I mean, yeah, because it's an ought question. It doesn't really matter what type of government you are currently. It's a question of what you ought to do. And if that means, like, having more checks and balances because it's a good moral goal to strive for, then yeah, I think that should be a relevant consideration.
But I also definitely agree with Hertzig that the type of information that we might be requesting, maybe it's not like campaign finance records or whatever. I don't really know if that's part of the resolution, whatever. But like in a non-democracy. Okay, so now onto the more important one. So the need for secrecy. I'll just start out with the easy thing. Hertzig, why does the resolution say need? It's a little random, right? A little strong.
It is pretty strong, but I think it's actually there to provide a little more balance to the topic, because I think that if it just said the right to know versus government secrecy, there would be a really big potential for, I mean, I think it would be just much harder to negate, because we could just be talking about illegitimate secrets, information that the public has a right to know about that the government is just choosing to keep secret. So I think the word need is there to make it a little easier to defend negating. I think the idea of a need for secrecy implies that there are legitimate reasons why the state might not want the public to have access to this information. And I think also that doesn't necessarily mean the information is always secret or is 100% secret. That, there's like, if it's particularly significant information, there might be some aspect or some element of it that the public does know about. But for example, with military operations, there's a lot of classified information because the government needs to keep that information secret, or there's a big risk of, enemy nations or whoever finding out about what the state is planning to do. So I think the word need is there to make it easier to justify keeping the information from the public.
With arguments like this, though, you kind of don't want to be a little overbearing on how sketchy you want to be, right? Like it's not like, as the negative, you should just go to every affirmative argument and be like, that just proves we didn't need the secrecy there. Like you don't want to go ham on this, right? But you just, it does kind of make the context for your arguments like a little better. Maybe it can dispel some really silly affirmative arguments.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that you want to go to every AF argument and say and make that response. Yeah, I think that it really is making the debate more about sort of security type issues, or, I mean, there might be other, situations where the government needs secrecy, but I think it's trying to move the debate, as you're saying, towards the more serious issues, as opposed to something that really is not necessary to classify.
Yeah, I also think there are two other sketchy things you could potentially get away with. So a common affirmative argument would probably be something along the lines of, government makes too many things secret. That's kind of bad for a bunch of reasons, like checks and balances, public debate, etc. And the negative will be like, well, I don't have to defend that overreach in any way. It's because it's just a need in this instance. So you gets you out of that entire set of affirmative arguments potentially.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I could see the affirmative being like, yeah, the government always says it needs the secrets.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not saying these are great sketchy arguments. I'm just saying these are the things that sort of came to my mind when you wrote "can't do anything sketchy with this," right into the.
Well. So just you can continue in a sec. I just wanted to let our listeners know that I didn't expect to be the least sketchy of my show hosts when I really come on to any podcast episode. Anyway, Lauren, let's continue.
I also think the second way that negatives could potentially try to be sketchy about this is how earlier we were talking about a balancing test, and one of the ways that the affirmative could answer a lot of these, exceptions type arguments, like to national security or medical data or et cetera. The affirmative could just be like, well, that proves the exception, not the rule. But maybe the negative would just be like, well, we're only debating about these exceptions in this instance because we're only debating about the need instances in this instance. So it would shift the debate away from that sort of broader right to know versus, government's right to keep things secret to very, very limited instances, which might favor the negative in this instance.
That definitely gets really complicated real fast, right? Like if the affirmative is like in the 1AR is like, balancing, none of your exceptions apply. I mean, the negative is like, in the 2N is like, need, none of your arguments apply. And then the judges are just like, you know,
Hmm.
I liked when in cross-ex you said his argument didn't have a warrant. You know, I mean, we'll talk about. Okay, yeah. So let's move on to secrecy. So two things that I wanna talk about here. The first is the types of things that are kept secret, and then the second is like a classification that I've come across in a couple of articles that I feel is very important to understand. So first thing, types of things that are kept secret. Lawrence, can you hit me up with some of these? What are the, like obviously like most of the time, although this is kind of what the resolution is asking about, most of the time the government shouldn't keep everything secret. So why does the government keep stuff secret? What's worth keeping secret?
There's a lot of reasons. So all of the articles that defend secrecy have their own list of exceptions that they like to have. For the Freedom of Information Act actually has 9 specific exemption categories that it claims are needed to exist to protect secrecy. The first obvious one is sort of classified information for national defense or foreign policy issues. There's also, you can research this yourself, but some of the other ones that are exempted from the Freedom of Information Act would include law enforcement records or information, trade secrets and confidential business information about companies, like financial data, bank supervision, etc., things like that, and medical files as well. But there's other things as well that are there.
Okay, so I just wanted to jump on this one random thing that you said that I didn't thought about. So when you say like business secrets or whatever, so I guess that also means like patents, right?
I think so.
Like if you like patent a process, like, or you like have a, you know, like a Coca-Cola's secret formula or whatever, and you like give it to the government so no one can steal it, right? Yeah. It's not like Pepsi can be like, hey, Freedom of Information Act government, like give me your recipe.
Yeah, can't do that.
Not, I mean,
it'd be really weird if you could do that and no one's figured out this loophole yet.
Yeah, what if the neg is just like, my entire case is just about the patent system and why that's key to the economy or something? that would be a very strange debate to all of a sudden have. But yeah, so national security stuff. Also, I found a bunch of stuff related to financial data. You know, it's like a lot of the articles I read that were really vague on this. Like Hertzig, correct me if I'm wrong about this. I haven't read a lot about it, but I think some people are worried that like if the people have the right to know everything about the economy, they'll like run on the banks or something. Like I read some stuff that said that, and I'm just wondering, like, is that really what they mean? Like, what exactly do they mean? But
yeah, I don't know. I haven't read a lot of the articles on that issue. I've seen them come up, but I haven't looked at them yet. But yeah, I think part of the issue, I think, is also that there in my searches, and I don't know if you found the same thing, I see the balance of the literature very heavily tilted affirmative. So when the neg articles come up, sometimes they're a little strange. But yeah, I haven't seen those specific articles, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, it wasn't even like a whole article. It was just kind of like people talking about exceptions, and there would be like a paragraph devoted to like finance or something.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like very many authors are like pressuring the government to release sensitive financial data. It's like, it seems like the clash of the literature is mostly centered around sort of national security exceptions anyways.
Yeah, it is weird that I've seen a bunch of people mention it as a type of thing that a government might want to do, and zero reference to a government ever doing it. So, like I don't really know. Like I'm trying to think like what would happen or whatever. Like all of a sudden we just like lose like GDP data or whatever, and people are like, hey, hey, Mr. President, can we have that? And he's like, no. And then we're like, do we have to sue you? Like, I'm just trying to think how that would happen. It would be very weird. Also, the fact that the resolution doesn't say United States really makes that like super weird as well, because it could just not even like have an impact, right? I mean, it's just like, it's like I don't know. Well, I mean, I guess it does have an impact. That was kind of a crass thing to say. I guess if people run on the banks in whatever country, it's probably bad for their economy. Speaking of which, there's another random argument I saw for the economy that I do not think is going to get a lot of press, but that is like kind of funny. I saw some people talking about just like accountability measures and like transparency measures and people having the right to know, which is like really expensive. Like there's just like a lot of bookkeeping costs. Like you just have to pay a bunch of people to do it, to like sift through data and stuff.
Yeah, I haven't seen that specifically, but I've seen...
It's a very minor argument.
Well, I think it's something that's sort of related, which I believe came up, and Lawrence might remember this coming up on that digital privacy topic that he debated, which was the idea of information overload. That, sometimes if you do have this complete right to know, or you do have so much information, it's very difficult to sort through it or to know kind of what is relevant or what's significant. And I don't think that that's an argument in favor of secrecy, but it does seem to be a defensive argument or, potentially a solvency deficit to some arguments, just that when there's a huge quantity of information, it makes it much more difficult to sort through and much more difficult to actually know which information is relevant or is good.
Yeah. It's kind of weird also. Well, actually, I'll let Lawrence talk, given that it was kind of like addressed to him.
Yeah. So one, the information overload stuff is totally true. And there's like even some people that recommend that the government should just dump as much information out as possible because it produces so much data to hide the real stuff in the middle of it. It's just like hiding it in plain sight. And just people won't be able to sort through the data anyways. And I think that is, in fact, a strong solvency deficit type argument against most affirmatives. But also, I'm not sure if it would really be that costly. I mean, it's not like they're petitioning, like the right to know is like requesting information that doesn't exist. It would just sort of be declassifying information that does exist somewhere in government databases. So I'm not sure if it would require so much additional bookkeeping that would overburden the federal government or our economy or something like that.
One thing that speaks to what you both have mentioned about this kind of like huge amount of data is, and this is just a general thing that the listeners can now sort of know about the resolution. So freedom of information laws, right? When countries have them, it would be very infrequent for me, right, to just be like, hey, government, like I private citizen want you to give me all these things and like file my own little request and squeeze the data out of you, right? Like that really doesn't happen. It's normally civil society people in non-governmental organizations that do stuff like that. And speaking to the information, overload question, really it would be them sifting through the data, right? Like there would be like 80,000 documents released online, right? And like these like hundreds of like, accountability NGOs would start pouring through it immediately. Whereas, I just go on channelfireball.com to check out the latest hot Magic the Gathering news, right? Instead, because I just don't have the time or attention span or really expertise to really sift through that. So maybe in countries without such good civil society balance, like the information overload is even more of a thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's something that I think even a lot of the literature that I've looked at overlooks, which is that you probably would need a third party. You probably need, whether it's a media source or an agency, to interpret what has been declassified. Because a lot of the time it's very difficult for the average citizen to even know what they're looking at. And so I think it's another potential sort of solvency deficit argument. You could talk about how if you don't have those institutions in place, it's much more difficult, even if the information does get out, for you to use that information as a citizen.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, so a lot of things that the government can decide to keep secret. One thing that I wanted to talk about very quickly so that we can move on is, so I came across in the literature some stuff that is the difference between a deep and shallow secret. And I just kind of wanted to go over that and get your guys' opinion on that. First of all, have you guys come across any of this before?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have? Okay.
I actually haven't. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, so there's a bunch of Posen articles, and by the way, the Posen articles are really good, about the difference between a deep and a shallow secret. And a shallow secret is where the information about a particular thing is hidden, but you know the thing is there. So, for example, we know that United States has it's kind of like public knowledge that there are drones around the world, right? Although people may not know where any given one is. That's a shallow secret because you don't know the content of the thing, but you know that it exists. And a deep secret is a secret that people don't even know is a secret. So for example, let's say the United States had some torture chamber in the Netherlands or whatever that it was secretly using to torture ISIS people, right? That's a secret, but it's also a deep secret because people don't even know it's a thing that is being kept secret.
Sure.
So I've seen a bunch of people talk about the difference between deep and shallow secrets in terms of establishing a balance, right, for secrecy and right to know, where Posen, for example, is basically all of the reasons that people give for secrecy fall apart for deep secrets. And all of the reasons that people give, for a for a right to know don't really make much sense for shallow secrets either. So it's potentially a case position, but I think people might even mention the difference between a deep secret and a shallow secret because they represent kind of unique problems, and maybe they will help kind of get at the balance that people are trying to establish in the literature. I don't know. I thought that I would mention that.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I think that it's what you sort of want to avoid in that is a case that only talks about one type and not the other, just because I think that makes it harder to have any real clash. But definitely, I think it's an issue that you could address in some form. I just don't know that you'd want the entire position to be about one type of secret.
Right. Because then if the affirmative is just deep secrets are bad and the negative is shallow positions are good, and they're judges, you decide.
Right.
Who
right.
wins this debate? And it's
right.
You sort of had a debate, more like you didn't. So but I could see the kind of balance in the resolution and sort of an observation-y section be kind of attributed to this, right? It's this is maybe one of the major conflicts of the resolution is whether or not deep secrets are allowed, because maybe everyone agrees that shallow secrets are fine.
Sure.
Right, but maybe deep secrets are bad, but then the negative can say that's a little too narrow. So whether this is a case position or just a random observation or just a thing that people reference in passing, maybe the other reason to know this is just that if your opponent reads a piece of evidence that is just that just says the words deep secrets a bunch when they're just passing it off as secrets bad, they're not actually saying all secrets are bad, right?
Right.
Their author is saying certain secrets are bad and others are fine.
Right.
And that can allow you to call them out on that.
Sure.
Okay. So that's what the resolution is. As usual, this took up a fair amount of time. But anyway, so in the next section, which will be a lot shorter, we'll talk about strategy at this tournament and at CFL Nats in general. All right, so let's talk strategy. So as I talked to you about Hertzig at the earlier of the podcast, your students have had some success at this tournament. So I just wanted to kind of pick your brain about this a little bit. So strategy for the CFL Nationals tournament generally, how is this tournament different from a normal debate tournament that you would go to? Not necessarily different from a national circuit tournament, because it's kind of stark in that, but more just how would this differ from your kind of average local tournament? Well, because it is closer to a local tournament, right?
It is, yeah. I think that one thing that's a difference, I think, in a good way, is that although the judging is very traditional, it tends to be traditional rather than, at least in my experience, it tends to be traditional rather than lay. And what I mean by that is, you often do have people who have judged or coached before or are coaches. They just might be coaches of local programs rather than coaches of big national circuit programs. And so I do think that, again, in my experience, I know this isn't everyone's, many of the judges that we've had over the years have flowed and have been sort of aware of the basic conventions of debate. It's just that what they want to see is often based on maybe a form of debate, a form of LD that doesn't really exist anywhere else except possibly NSDA nationals anymore. So I think that some of the things that they want to see are a clear and well-defined position on each side. So very different from what you might do, certainly on the circuit, but also even at a local tournament. They really want a story for each side, and they want arguments that are grounded in reality. So I know I keep sort of comparing this to the circuit, but I think for me, that's the more natural comparison, because in New York, we don't really have a local circuit. All our local tournaments end up being sort of feeders for, what ends up being TOC competition, TOC level competition. So we were talking earlier about how
that's not true in Florida, by the way.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I just, I don't have,
or at least Central Florida.
I don't have a good sense of what local debate looks like because we don't really have local debate.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's pretty much all the local tournaments that we have end up being judged by, if it's like novice, it's judged by a lot of varsity debaters who are competing at TOC bid tournaments. And if it's varsity, it's often parent judges. But, we don't really have a separate local circuit. So anyway, yeah, we were talking earlier about extremes and how people often do that, or people often make arguments that are related to the extremes on the national circuit. And in my experience, that's really not what judges at NCFL want to see. They want you to be very reasonable. They want you to make arguments about empirical examples that they've heard of, and they want you to talk about things that they can visualize. And I think that's one key element in general in adaptation, but specifically for NCFL, is to discuss arguments in a way that can create a visual image for the judge of what you're talking about. Because I think that when they can see it sort of mentally, it's much easier for them to understand what the argument's about. So those are some of the things that I think are just in general important to keep in mind about the tournament.
I want to agree with everything that you just said, although I didn't know it. It sounds right to me. But one thing that I want to say is, just very quickly, is that really people in circuit debate need that tangibility lesson too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I actually think that they're much worse at it than the average debater that we will debate at this tournament. Okay, now let's talk about strategy generally on the resolution. So I have sort of 5 questions that I thought that I would sort of shoot around with you guys, and let's not spend too much time on any specific one. So first question: there are a lot of statistics on this topic about like the success of freedom of information laws and on their effects on corruption, etc. And there's like tons of data. Is this a tournament, Hertzig and maybe Lawrence too, that we should like try to get into really in-depth statistics debates with our opponents? Like, because it's possible that could be a thing if you wanted to do that. Like, is that a thing that we should want to do?
I don't know that you want to have a full statistics debate with them, but I definitely think you want to have numbers when you're, I think statistics, numbers in general, and as I said earlier, concrete, real, empirical examples, all of those are critical. So I think if you have statistics, if you have numbers and your opponent doesn't, pointing that out is really important. And saying that you're the one with the numbers or you're the one with the math or whatever can be very persuasive to a CFL panel. I think that if you're having an actual debate over the statistics, that then you might lose them. But just having the numbers in general, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and if you want to have a statistics debate with your opponent, I guess you should probably like not have it be too complicated, right? It shouldn't be like my study is better than theirs for like the following 5 reasons. It should mostly be like, I guess my study is more topical or something. Like if you were going to have a debate about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want the debate to be just about the evidence itself, probably looking to, right, the relationship to the topic, the specificity of the evidence, just sort of, and some of the things that you would look to anyway, like the recency and the qualifications of the author. I think those are things you can always point to, but I don't find that a lot of, and I don't know how many people are aware of this, but at NCFL, judges actually cannot call cards.
Yeah, they get fined.
Yep. So you don't want to go too far in that direction because they have no way of verifying anything that's being said about the evidence.
Oh, I guess that also creates some like psychological effects, right? Where it's like even if you're out debating your opponents and they don't really need to call for it, maybe some of them would think that because they can't call for it, they just shouldn't even think about it.
Right.
Because they can't even like really figure it out whether it's you are being right or not.
Right.
So.
And I don't think the debaters, I don't remember what's in that list of rules that they give everyone on day one.
Oh, me neither.
I don't think that debaters can look at each other's evidence either.
Wait, really? They can't? That would, oh my God, that would be.
I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure, but I don't think that they can.
Wow. That would be. All right. I already thought that the rules were weird and I didn't even know that rule. If that rule exists, we should.
Yeah, don't quote me on this. I don't know.
You should get back to me, by the way, about whether or not that rule exists at some point, because that's actually a really funny rule. Anyway.
Yeah, I will definitely find that out.
Okay, second thing is, so a lot of the affirmative impacts I've noticed kind of bleed together. Like there's a lot of stuff about the importance of accountability. There's stuff about the importance of democracy, checks and balances, and a lot of those kind of and like corruption as well. And a lot of those are kind of like internal links to each other or really connect to each other in very explicit ways. How should the fact that a lot of the impacts seem to bleed together, at least a lot of the affirmative impacts, how should that inform maybe our casing or the arguments that we make? Like, so for example, let's say that the affirmative case has, a democracy good contention and a checks and balances contention and an accountability contention and informed citizenry is good contention. And they all basically say the same thing. Just how, or maybe there's minor differences. How at this tournament do you recommend maybe changing your approach or not to account for those things? Am I being clear?
Yeah, I think that the way to do it is to try to have different warrants for why you get those things as opposed to focusing on the impacts themselves. So in other words, I agree. I think accountability, checks and balances, democratic procedure, whatever, those are very similar, but they all seem to be similar at the impact level. So to me, it seems like you want to have 2 or 3 different ways in which prioritizing the right to know above secrecy achieves those things. And so I think if the difference is at the warrant level rather than at the impact level, that creates enough of a difference for the judges to understand how one argument is separate from another.
And there is some advantage to having slightly different good sounding things to call your contentions. And I mean, if my point is not that you're trying to bamboozle the judge when you're really presenting the same things. Of course, your points should be meaningfully different, but it does allow you to have, as you said, a sort of thematic case, your case is centered around democratic procedures being good or whatever, and one of them is checks and balances, and another one is kind of democracy. It allows you to theme your case pretty well.
Yeah, and I think that's really a lost art as well, because that used to be, way back in the day, that was actually kind of a norm on the national circuit, was sort of positional debating, the idea that your case revolves around a central thesis and the arguments you make link back to that thesis. And, obviously very few people do that, if anyone, these days anymore. But at this tournament, that's really the way to go in my experience.
Okay. So next question. So one of the things that we stressed in the last topic analysis episode that we do, and a sort of important thing to think about, is like, we want to talk about when we're constructing affirmative cases, we kind of want to have the normal negative arguments in mind. So the way to do that with this topic, Lawrence, correct me if I'm wrong, would be, as we kind of talked about earlier, kind of anticipate those exceptions that the negative is likely to bring up and kind of structure your case in such a way to make those kind of non-issues, or at least less important than they would normally be, right?
Yeah, I also think like one way to approach this is to have some of the implications to your affirmative arguments be directly to directly answer some common negative arguments. So one example is sort of this, secrecy undermines the ability of the public to debate, and that's sort of necessary to sustain a healthy democracy, which is sort of a good affirmative case implication. But it also would be strategic to have sort of an implication or impact from this argument that is like, lack of public debate actually makes achieving national security objectives more difficult because it includes less, well-read, less perspectives in the public debate concerning, for example, counterterrorism efforts. And that actually makes us less safe in the long run. And so I think having these sort of multiple implications that directly interact with the most common exceptions that the negative is going to cite is also a good way to directly preempt these negative arguments.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Hertzig, or should we just move on to the next one?
I think that that's totally right. And I think that is one of the more strategic things you can do at this tournament, because sometimes the judges have different levels of experience with debate. Sometimes they have different types of flowing abilities. But I think if you explicitly preempt negative arguments the way that Lawrence was talking about, even if they might miss a response that you make, in the 1AR to a negative argument, they are likelier to have gotten down some form of your preempt if you were very explicit when you made it in the case. So I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I'm always a huge fan of making your implications like kind of your own arguments as explicit as possible. In every type of debate. But I also think that especially at a tournament like this, I would like weight implications and explanation of your arguments much higher than even evidence.
Oh yeah.
Like, I think that's actually just way more important. You should have like I think the analysis to evidence ratio should be like 2 or 3 to 1.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we have two more things down here. I guess we can talk about them very, very quickly. They're actually not that important. So one of them is like, how does the right to know really like come about? We sort of already talked about that. Is it enforced by the courts? Do kind of the executive self-enforce it? Does it matter? What do you guys think about that? Does it matter? Probably not, right?
Well, I think, it could matter in the sense that whoever is enforcing it, and I do think that's an interesting question of who enforces it. Whoever's enforcing it is still coming from within the government, most likely, which might be a potential problem, or might be some sort of solvency deficit for the AF. I will say that I was reading an article earlier today. It's by Aftergood, and it was about this issue, partly about this issue of enforcement, or about sort of a couple of successful examples of declassifying information. And the author was arguing that these two programs, which were both agency programs, so both part of the federal bureaucracy, that these were the best ways of actually getting information to the people. One was the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, or the ISCAP. And the other was, I'm just trying to find it, was the Fundamental Classification Policy Review, or the FCPR. So both of those are actually coming from within the or not like the specific agencies that are hiding information, but they're coming from the government itself. And yet contrary to what you might expect, they tended to release much more information than they kept classified. So I don't know if that directly answers the question of like, does it matter who enforces it? But I do think that there's evidence that talks about the efficacy of having government agencies responsible for declassification.
Yeah, I think it could maybe affect some arguments, like about, for example, discretion of the executive branch or whatever, because one negative argument might say, like, it's important that our officials have discretion, like they know more than the public does, like what's a national security issue, and they should be able to decide that like in secret without having the public breathing down their neck. But maybe you could say, hey, this is the government. It is still the government doing it. They're just erring on the side of disclosure as opposed to non-disclosure.
Right.
So maybe that's interesting. And the next question, it no longer makes sense. I don't know why I wrote it. Okay, so when we get to the next section, we're going to go through some AF positions and some neg positions. So as normal, we'll be talking about 3 affirmative positions that it's good to know, 3 negative positions that it's good to know. We'll also talk about ways of answering these positions. So the first position that I have here is kind of a corruption and accountability argument, with those kind of being the inverse of each other. And the overall argument is that the right to know decreases corruption by allowing the citizens the opportunity to kind of like make sure that their government is doing what they want. And if the government isn't doing what they want, they'll kick them out. And or at least government officials will be kind of deterred, aka they will just not even do it because of fear. They'll be deterred from undergoing corruption or corrupt activity in the future. So there are a couple of specific wrinkles here. The first one is empirics. I don't know about both of you. So I found actually a pretty good amount of negative literature on this, but I've also found a decent amount of affirmative literature, mostly like from like, you know, people like the United Nations, and there are tons of other studies that study freedom of information laws that find that accountability decreases corruption. I don't know where the balance of the literature exactly lies. My intuition is that it's like a little neg-leaning on the empirics. On the analytic warrant seems very strong for the affirmative though. And you know, so this is kind of the argument that like every single article on the topic makes in the first few paragraphs, right? This like corruption thing.
Right. Yeah. What I've seen is kind of what you're describing, which is people who are arguing that it would be good for accountability for the public to have more information, but then also saying various reasons why it doesn't happen or it hasn't happened. And so some of that, I'm not like the articles in general seem to be affirmative leaning, but some of the problems that they raise seem to be very difficult to surmount. So I don't know if some of those arguments could be used by the neg to say, you know, you're not actually going to get the benefits that you claim you will through the right to know. Yeah.
That's actually a very good point. So tons of articles on the resolution, Lawrence, you know, they say things like, hey, it would be great to have all of this information. It's a shame that a bunch of the governments that have done the freedom of information laws have the following 16 barriers, right? And I think what Hertzig is bringing up, and I kind of agree, is that it's difficult to know whether that is an objection to the affirmative or not, because the affirmative could, you know, on the one hand, the affirmative could say, well, this just means that if we really had the right to know, like if it was implemented well, then things would be great. And, you know, things, you know, there would be like lots of daisies and whatever, everything would be awesome. I don't know why I just started talking about daisies. You know, things are, or, you know, yeah, sorry, wrong flower metaphor. Things would be coming up roses, right? You know, if it was implemented correctly. Or, you know, you could equally as well see the negative say, Well, this is just an example of how when we try to do the right to know, it just doesn't do anything. Like, people don't end up really knowing more things. So the affirmative, doesn't solve anything. So, it's difficult to see. And, I'm interested in your opinion maybe on whether or not that actually is an objection to the affirmative, or whether it's just a contentious debate enough that when you're negative, you should say the argument that I just said, and when you're affirmative, you should say the other one.
So I personally am inclined to lean a little bit more AF on this issue, that it is sort of like an argument for why we need the right to know, mostly because I think on a lot of these overly broad philosophical topics, that very specific examples of solvency deficits that could easily be bypassed through like a different government structure or crafting better legislation aren't particularly responsive to the value question that the affirmative sort of poses. But that's just sort of my thought on it.
See, I have sort of the opposite thought, and maybe Hertzig can sort of weigh in and decide this debate between us. But I tend to lean negative on these questions because I am just a little skeptical of trying to kind of like avoid debating your opponent on stuff like this. Like, I normally am like very hesitant to tell my debaters just like, just say that this argument doesn't really apply to your case, and that in a perfect world, these barriers wouldn't exist or something like that. So normally I would tend to err that these are solvency deficits, but what do you think, Katie?
Well, I'm going to satisfy no one because I'm very much in the middle on this.
Oh, nice.
I think that you can reasonably say on the AF that these are reasons why the right to know ought to be prioritized, and why, even if a stronger right to know wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, you would at least move closer to the direction that the government ought to be going in. And since it's sort of an ought question, especially since it's phrased as more of a philosophical topic, I don't know that you need to show that affirming results in massive change to the society so much as you need to show why that change would be a good thing. So I think if I were AF in a round, I would make the argument that way. On the other hand, I do think that the neg can say that there's the AF really can't talk about achieving accountability or checks and balances or the ideal democracy in a world where all of these attempts at reform seem to fail, and there seem to be some insurmountable problems to the implementation of a right to know or freedom of information or whatever. So I really do think that you could use these arguments on both sides, just depending on which side you're on.
So Lawrence, let's talk about one way to answer this. How would you go about answering this argument? Obviously you could maybe say that corruption, accountability, empirics go negative, or that there are some reasons why it wouldn't actually decrease corruption. Are there any other ways that you would go about it?
I think there are a couple, and the ones that you just mentioned are pretty good. I'll talk about one. I would guess that most negatives are going to largely agree with sort of this, accountability and corruption is good, right to know is good generally, but just simply argue that the sort of exceptions that they've presented provide reasons in that specific situation why you don't really want accountability. You would rather have that sort of secrecy. And I think the best example is sort of just the national security exception, which is that you should try to hold the government accountable generally, but in specific instances of like maybe a direct counterterrorism operation that you want to keep secret from the enemy, that it's in fact good to not have accountability because it prevents other people from knowing your plans and knowing how you're going to tackle this national security threat. So I think they'll just simply argue that exceptions will get around a lot of this AF objections, or this AF argument, sorry.
All right. Speaking of AF arguments, the second one is kind of a democracy and checks and balances good argument. And the basic argument that I've seen advanced in a lot of places, just a lot, and I'm sure Hertzig can back me up that this argument is everywhere. But the overall argument is that an informed citizenry is good for society, for democracies and non-democracies. It allows them to check the government, of course, which kind of bleeds into the accountability stuff. But it also is just a democracy is better when a society is better when the people in a democracy are kind of able to be kind of directly looped into the policies that are happening. It's a little bit less of kind of like a secret tribunal sort of situation. And I found a lot of literature suggesting that talking about and this part's really interesting, the quality of decisions. Have you come across a lot of this stuff in your research as well, Hertzig?
Yeah, I agree. I've seen it everywhere. And I think that most staff authors that I've seen make that argument. And a lot of them don't even really explain, they don't go into a lot of detail warranting the argument. But yeah, there's definitely an assumption that more information equals, better decisions, better public decisions by the people.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of very specific arguments just on the decision-making side of things, which I would maybe point out. You can have a lot of different criterions with a case like this. You could have a criterion that has to do with just kind of directly democracy is good, informed citizenry is good, popular sovereignty is good. But you could also just have one that's a little more utilitarian-y, because I've just come across a lot of stuff that talks about why how like decision making becomes really really bad, like private actor decision making becomes bad under conditions of secrecy, like they just make worse decisions, like in terms of their consequences, I don't know if you all have seen that as well.
Yeah, something that I've seen talks about that issue in terms of over or underestimating threat levels. So one of the things that I think is interesting is, the resolution says the government's need for secrecy, but that assumes that the government is acting as one institution, when in fact that's usually not the case. The government is broken up into many sub-institutions and different, depending on the society you're in, but different branches, different actors. And so when there's secrecy, that often means that some actors within the government don't have access to the information. It's not the entire government versus the people. It's whatever part of the government has the information versus other parts of the government as well as the people. And so I think a really interesting turn to a lot of security arguments that you can make if you're AF is the idea that when the government itself doesn't have access to the information because it's been classified, when there are agents within the government who don't know it, that results in really bad public policy. So it's not just a matter of the people knowing, but it's also a matter of other actors within government knowing or not knowing. And that can cause them to over or underestimate the level of a threat from an external force. So it can actually jeopardize national security even more.
Yeah, and serially incompetent. Like so there's a lot of just it's kind of funny, because one of the main arguments here is that it leads to kind of serial incompetence in policymaking, which, even though secrecy is good to eliminate, national security threats, it's kind of like a very intuitive point. It's a lot less intuitive that government's just making a lot of bad decisions in the long run compromises our national security. But it definitely does impact back to that. So what would be the best way of answering this, Lawrence?
I think there are a few ways, but I think the sort of best direct answer that a lot of negatives will pose is simply that secrecy is actually necessary to make good government decisions and to inform deliberation. And so I forget what the author is, but they make an argument that says that the more secrets that the government has, the less likely they are to sort of feel pressured to, talk about things that they might find objectionable. So it actually prevents ideas from being heard on the table. It's actually necessary to protect outsiders from influencing the decision-making process unduly, like special interest groups or foreign governments, for instance. And it's necessary to prevent people who would be affected by the decision-making process. So specifically in the context of national security, like the targets of counterterrorism operations from interfering and manipulating these discussions. And so it's actually, in terms of democracy and discussion and public debate, it's actually better if the government has some degree of secrecy.
Yeah, there's really a thriving, really cool literature based on this, which is one of the reasons why I love the resolution. Okay, and next affirmative argument and last affirmative argument that we're going to talk about, of course, there are many more. As Hertzig said, that it's really the literature is very affirmative biased here, is Kant stuff. Now, this one took me, Kant as in the big K, Immanuel Kant, the main man. I'm literally wearing a shirt right now that says Kant touched this. That's not even a joke. I'm actually just wearing that right now. Unintentional, but excellent. I own 2 copies of this shirt to express my devotion. Anyway, so Kant type arguments are a real, like the CFL national tournament is really a time for these types of arguments to shine. And I believe, although they get their fair amount of play in other forms of debate as well, and I've seen a couple of ways that Kant could be said to affirm this resolution. One of them that a couple people have talked about is what's called the principle of publicity, and I haven't read really deep into completely understanding what this is, but I think the argument is that the idea is that any decision has to kind of be publicly justifiable in order for it to be kind of a valid exercise of your reason. And therefore, Posen randomly says that this means that maybe secrecy is bad, or at least deep secrecy is bad, because if you aren't willing to give stuff up, you have to be willing to give your stuff up to the public, which means people have a right to know some of your stuff. I don't know if you all have come across this argument in the literature. I'm aware that it exists. It's a very small part of the literature, as most Kantian arguments are. So there's that. And then one other Kantian argument that I've read is, I'm not exactly sure whether this argument affirms the resolution, but there are some people that say that people in a society kind of have rights to information, or they kind of give the government, some power, and as a consequence, it's really their information. They really own it. It's not really they elected someone to government office. The government doesn't really have the right to say, no, you can't have it, because the only reason that they have power is from the citizens. So maybe it's possible to make a property rights argument based on that, and tie that to a Kantian framework. That one seems a little bit more of a stretch, but it's possible that could exist. Have you come across any Kantian stuff? I mean, it's really a small part of whatever literature, I would say, but
I haven't really, but I haven't really been looking for it. Yeah, I think those arguments are really interesting, especially the second one. I find interesting because that you could probably make an argument with or without Kant that information that directly affects the people, the public, is information that they are entitled to above and beyond any government needs, because that's information that can directly impact their lives. So, maybe they do have, I don't know if I would necessarily frame it as a property interest, but certainly, there's a personal interest that exceeds just a desire to have the information. They actually, it's almost like they need the information, maybe as much as or more than the government needs secrecy. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to frame the AF. Because I think a lot of people, when they talk about a right to know, they don't necessarily talk about why people have a right to that information. So I think that could be really interesting. But yeah, I don't know about the specific Kantian background there.
Yeah, I think the property rights stuff is interesting, and the main way, so that we can move on to negative arguments, that I might go about answering some stuff like this, especially the property rights argument, one main way to, the first obvious main way to answer these types of arguments is just to have a framework debate with your opponent, right? I mean, like if you win your value criterion as the negative, you should kind of like trump a lot of these affirmative contentions. A lot of them are not transferable to like a more sort of, I would say, like a utilitarian sort of negative position about national security.
Sure.
What do you think, Lawrence?
I'll just add so framework debate is one way to go about it, and just to simply claim that, like, for example, an exception might matter. If you read the article about publicity in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it has some very nuanced arguments about sort of Kant's stance on secrecy. Also, Kant's argument against secrecy seems to be one of his weaker arguments, since it fundamentally boils down to something like, if a public policy cannot withstand publicity, it must be unjust and can't be universalized or whatever. That doesn't seem to really be a strong argument, because it could merely just be an unpopular policy. That doesn't mean it's sort of a bad policy from a moral perspective. And again, that policy specifically would have to, be justified through some other moral means that you could contest later.
Not to get into a detailed Kant debate on the podcast.
Right. So, I mean, there are ways to answer this, is simply what I'm saying. Yeah.
But I mean, normally Kant is assuming a pretty impartial group of reasoners who are kind of doing the judging, right? It's not just like, so that it wouldn't just be that the policy is unpopular.
Well, but but Kant's specific warrant for secrecy in this instance, as he writes in, I think, Perpetual Peace, I think is his essay that he talks about this, is like, if it has to be secret for it to like exist, then it's probably an unjust policy, since it can't be justified to the people it's supposed to work for. But that's sort of the response to that point, is like, well, it doesn't have to be unjust. It could just merely be unpopular. Anyways.
All right. Let's move on to some neg arguments. So the first one I'm actually not going to talk about basically at all, because we've already talked about it like a ton. This is the exceptions argument. I just kind of group these together. You can have a group of them, you can have a couple of them for your contention, but things like national security, disease prevention was something I saw randomly mentioned at one point in like a study. There was the financial stability stuff that we talked about before. One brief wrinkle that I wanted to talk about very quickly is privacy rights. I'm not sure whether this is an exception, whether this is a negative argument, or whether like it's not, but it seems to be like a negative argument you could maybe use to answer affirmative things. One argument I've seen for government secrecy is that like a lot of times revealing government secret information would also reveal personal and private personal information. So, for example, like, the activities of government employees might be also like information that individuals would love to be kept confidential. And that kind of violates their own property rights in that. So this argument is not that like the government has property rights per se to its own information. It's more that there's some civilian information that will be hit in the crossfire. Have you guys found anything related to this? I didn't find that much, but I found some stuff about it.
Yeah. Well, so I actually, and I don't know if this is relevant to the resolution or not, but I have seen stuff on politicians, legislators, people in government, and their privacy being threatened with a public right to know. So I haven't seen it necessarily in terms of like civilian privacy, but I don't know if it counts as like the government if we're talking about individuals within the government,
or even really a need for secrecy.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know if it is relevant, but yeah, I have seen stuff about, like if a legislator has, I don't know, like a history of mental illness, or a history or physical illness, or like whatever other personal issues they might have, whether that information is something the public can demand. Does the public have a right to know that information, and to what extent does that compromise the individual's privacy? So yeah, I've seen a little on that.
Yeah, okay. So we're not going to talk about ways of answering these types of arguments because we've already done that at length. Okay, so the second negative argument that I want to talk about is kind of a social contract argument. And the argument that I've seen is like sort of like this, and I'm really not sure that this argument is very good, but I've seen it made by a bunch of people, and a couple people make it in the form of like an appeal to like the tradition of America's founding fathers or whatever. But of course, the resolution isn't U.S. specific, so you can't let the negative get away with just doing that. But the argument, as I've seen it presented, is something like when we give up some rights to the government in order that they can like kind of like administer us judiciously, and one of those sort of things that it's good to give up is kind of like access to all of the information. I think that this argument is not like really like a good standalone argument, if that makes sense. Like this argument itself does not really make a negative case, but it can maybe be a philosophical justification combined with maybe some exceptions for answering some affirmative arguments. I'm not really sure how I think about this, but what do you guys think about it? Like, is this a real argument? Like, maybe we should talk about something else? Like,
I mean, I personally think that a lot of the examples for like why social contract goes negative sort of collapses back onto sort of more utilitarian justifications for those exceptions that exist. So it's just like the social contract says that you should give up your right to total knowledge about everything for the sake of the government making you safer. Here are some examples of the government making you safer. But then, you know, that sort of begs the question, is the government making you safer in that instance? So I think that a lot of these, and even these negative authors who sort of push these social contract objections sort of recognize that it does, in fact, sort of depend heavily on this exceptions argument.
Yeah, I think it is an argument that we're going to see a lot. And I think that it's something that you could definitely read. But I think you would need like an internal link to actually achieving whatever the social contract benefit is, like security or whatever. So I think that it's not enough to say that there is a need for secrecy or protection or whatever under the social contract, but instead you'd have to show, or in addition to that, you'd have to show that you actually sort of meet that need through secrecy.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Just a quick side note, I did find a card that says that Hobbesian absolutism negates. So if we just want to go for like, you know, like government, like authoritarian impulse good, like we could just like go ham on that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a tough sell with some of have at NCFL.
With any of the judges.
Yeah.
Yeah, well. Okay, so and then the last argument that I wanted to talk about is the corruption argument, and I've already talked about this at length above. So there are a lot of studies, and if you are kind of interested in some of them, feel free to send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, and we can hit you up with some of those. One thing that I just wanted just to give you a very quick summary. Some people think that like it's kind of intuitive that corruption would go up, or sorry, that corruption would go down with the introduction of like transparency laws. There's this one article that everyone mentions like in one line of an article, and I looked up originally, that says that actually freedom of information laws kind of like have the potential to create a different effect where it just lets the different corrupt people know who they should bribe now.
What article is that?
I can send it to you. It's back in BAC in 2001. But once you start getting into the empirics, everyone mentions it in like one line. It's like, this guy in 2001 said that actually it could, you know, tell you who to bribe instead. And the actual article like basically says, hey, people don't appreciate this negative possible effect, and I'm not really going to say which of those effects I say is stronger, but I really think that you should think about this negative effect.
Yeah, well, something that that occurred to me as I was looking at some of the literature that seemed to be negating. So I sort of saw two types of articles. One was the straight up, you know, national security good, secrecy key to national security, those types of arguments. And then the other was more of a criticism, and I think this is maybe what this article that you're talking about is more in this category, sort of a criticism of the right to know, or the idea that the right to know would solve any of these problems, and arguments that said actually more release of information could increase corruption. And so I think there are also arguments you can make about how even if government secrecy, even if there are like problems with it, the effects of releasing or declassifying the information are actually worse than what you have in a world with secrecy.
Yeah, I've seen a ton of articles that are like, well, not a ton. A lot of articles say that, look, the Freedom of Information laws in the United States was all well and good, but basically what happened in the 80s and 90s was that every other country in the world copied our exact law without really implementing it differently. And that as a consequence, some of those places without the kind of institutional infrastructure to really implement this effectively, like a sort of already thriving court system, a healthy respect for the rule of law, etc. And that when you try to apply the Freedom of Information laws like directly and act like they'll solve all the problems, it actually kind of creates a perverse masking effect where like people think that things are great because they have these laws, when really the laws don't really do very much. But but the UN says they're sufficient to prevent corruption, so that's good enough. I agree with your distinction. There are also just a lot of articles that do actually just say that transparency increases corruption, like specifically. So two things before we move off of this. When sifting through this literature base, a lot of them use this random data set called the International Corruption Risk Guide. I don't know enough about it, but if you find an article that talks about the ICRG, that's what it's referencing. They basically all use it. And the second, and it's sort of a very interesting question that, if you'll permit, we could maybe talk about for like just a little tiny bit, since I don't think it'll be particularly relevant. There's a very interesting question about how you measure corruption. It's a very difficult thing to measure, right? And one measure of corruption that I've seen a lot that is like a little dubious, if you think about it, is citizen trust of the government. And I assume you've like read this too. And here's the problem. So a lot of people take citizen trust of the government being low as a sign that corruption is high.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also take that as being the opposite, because, let's imagine a country and the, citizen trust of the government was like 100%, right? But the government kept secrets. It's like, well, maybe that's just because they don't know any of the shady stuff their government is doing. So on the one hand, citizen trust of the government going down could actually be kind of good, because it means that corruption is being exposed and dealt with.
Right.
As opposed to just like it being like, oh, citizen trust of the government is high, that must mean the government is not doing anything shady. Or it could just mean that shady things are coming to light.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't encountered that or thought about it that way, but I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and a couple I just read an article just yesterday where the author was like, yep, corruption definitely goes down because people think that their government is less corrupt. And I was like, and some other authors think that. Anyway, the best ways to answer this is with other statistics. You could also just kind of bypass some of the statistics debate. Like, obviously the analytic warrant for this, aka the just like understanding of why transparency would decrease corruption, like the understanding of those things is very easy to grasp. It's a very easy story to tell, right? Even if maybe the stats don't bear it out. So when you're affirmative, you could always do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the more intuitive story is the F story, even if there's like evidence to suggest otherwise. So yeah, that's probably I think just, the logical link between more information and less corruption seems to be more direct than the link that goes in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Definitely. And another thing, this is the last thing that I'll say before we wish Hertzig, a tearful goodbye, is that a lot of these studies are kind of like, they just talk about sort of transparency in general, or they talk about freedom of information laws may be construed very, very broadly. And as the affirmative, you could argue that maybe these aren't the resolution. Maybe right to know is a little different than some of those things.
Sure. Yeah. I think that definitely focusing on the specific right in the topic as opposed to transparency in general would be good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, those are our negative and affirmative arguments. That's our strategy guide, and that's what the resolution means. So before we move on to our next segment, it's time to say goodbye to our fantastic guest. Thank you very much for coming on, Hertzig. You were just a really incredible guest, and we're lucky to have you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
And if any listeners see Hertzig at a tournament, feel like is there any like special catchphrase that they know how to address you by?
No.
They say like, oh, hey there, Mr. H or whatever, and that's like code for podcast listener,
They certainly can do that, or they can just say hi. That's fine too.
Yeah. Try not to be too weird. Okay. Thank you very, very, very much for coming on, and we'll see you guys in the concluding segment. All right, well, that's our episode for this week. So thanks to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast. You can still sign up for any of their camps, albeit the Swarthmore one and the LA one, both of the ones in July. The camps are going to be incredible. Like us on Facebook, like us on, follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter account's actually pretty dead. Shouldn't necessarily do that, but send us lots of emails at the argumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, especially if Lawrence offends you in any way, or if my rugged good looks offend you too.
There's a reason this is a podcast, not a video podcast.
Yeah, Lawrence, I don't know. Have you ever heard the phrase "face for radio"?
No, what is that?
Dude, it's a great way to insult someone. Like, if you say, like, man, he has a face for radio, that actually means you're ugly.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I'll keep that in mind.
It's actually, like, a really, like, low-key, really old-timey way to just, like, insult someone. So, yeah, Lawrence, you're, like, my face is great for a podcast.
Yeah. It also makes sense that your Hangouts profile picture is not of you, and I think that's a really considerate thing to have done for everyone who knows.
To be fair, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is my profile photo, is just actually so attractive. In some random BuzzFeed quiz I read, he was like #1 most attractive philosopher, and I
got a high standard
before BuzzFeed made it cool. So maybe my looks are great. Honestly, like my picture is way more attractive than your picture, mostly because it's Wittgenstein versus you. So
yeah, I mean, I never said I was good looking. I also have an excellent face for radio and podcasts.
You should also make your face the face of an analytic philosopher, and then we can have it go down. Maybe Bertrand Russell. He's like, I tried to find, like, I remember one time. Okay, we're getting way off topic now, but
is this the mini debate now? The most attractive?
No.
Philosopher? Oh, dang.
No. But wait, maybe it should be. No. Yeah. So when I was trying to in college, I created for a real college class, I created a custom Magic the Gathering set for like pragmatic and traditional philosophy. That's a real thing that you now know about me, that I did. And I was trying to find an unattractive picture of Bertrand Russell, and I eventually found one, but it was really hard. Bertrand Russell is actually so attractive and cool looking. You guys should all Google image him. He's actually nuts. Okay, so send us email. VBI is good, etc., etc. Okay, now the mini debate, the only important segment of the podcast. Unfortunately, Hertzig had to leave, so he can't be on this segment.
He had to leave because he has a real life, whereas we clearly do not.
I have so many real lives. I've collected so many real lives that if I die, I'll just respawn really efficiently, close to the end of the level, if you know what I mean. Okay, so mini debate now. I will let you make the first move on this because I know you are probably in a better position to judge this. I'm going to go Mac versus PC.
Oh, okay.
Which do you think is better, a Mac or a PC?
I own both. I'm gonna go for PC on this one.
You want to hit me with a few warrants?
So performance for price, I think PC's just winning. The current generation of Macs is way overpriced. It has the last generation of Intel processors. The touch bar is pretty much a gimmick that's kind of useless. Only a few USB-C ports. Yes, USB-C is the future, but more Windows laptops are increasingly adding more I/O, including USB-C. Windows laptops are quickly closing the ground between, or PCs quickly closing the ground between sort of the style of Macs that they've long been known to have, like the really good like solid aluminum finishes and stuff. Keyboards and trackpads are all catching up. So PC, I think in terms of performance, budget, and looks are beating or matching the Mac, which means that sort of the only difference now between them is sort of high-end processing, such as content creation versus gaming. I think PC destroys on gaming customizability. You can only really game on a PC, and it's just infeasible to game on a Mac, which means that it limits an entire usage purpose out for the Mac. Mac maybe has sort of Final Cut Pro going in its favor in terms of content creation. So I guess if you're a very high-end content creator, I guess you could do that. But even then, like you have to pay thousands of dollars, like $3,000 for the higher end of the Mac Pro lineup to get a Mac that is capable of using Final Cut Pro to its extremes. Whereas you could get an equivalent Windows PC with the same processing power that runs Adobe that runs Adobe Premiere, that would allow you to do similar amounts of content creation for a much lower price. So unless you're just an Apple person that's already been locked into their ecosystem, then I think it's pretty much very obviously in favor of PC.
That was a nice treatise.
Yeah.
But so
I will say that I do carry a Mac because I bought it back before I think sort of current generation Windows laptops were matching the portability levels of the Mac. Also, I do sort of don't mind being integrated into the Apple ecosystem. So like I own an iPhone and a Mac, and so having iMessage is nice.
Jeez.
But I think all of that is just so heavily outweighed by the benefits of a PC.
Yeah, I disagree. I think that Macs are better. I just in experience, I think that their customizability, not in terms of features, but in terms of like the ability to have many different desktops. I don't know.
So Windows 10 does have multiple desktops. You can actually 4-finger swipe on the trackpad of most desktops to create a new one, or you can 4-finger swipe up or click the desktop button in the bottom left-hand corner, create desktops. You can switch back and forth between them by clicking Control, Windows, and the arrow key for whichever direction you want to go, or 4-finger swipe on the trackpad.
It's the problem with Windows that I didn't know that I could do that.
Whereas in fairness, most Macs, there's a large
Macs are very user-friendly too.
I actually, yes, they're definitely very smooth to operate, and they're sort of user friendly. But I think the sort of inability to integrate them with the vast majority of other computer networks. So, for example, I can't use my Mac for most of the classes that I have in college because they require specific PC applications. So I think that alone sort of hampers user friendliness. I also think that most modern Windows laptops that are in the same price range as Macs are just as user friendly as Macs are in terms of their ease of operation and portability. One
pretty good argument in favor of Macs is that their kind of life cycle is very long, I believe.
That's true of higher end Macs, but it's also true of higher end PCs. Like, so I originally owned a cheaper, like $400 Asus laptop that lasted about two and a half years. But if you go for a higher end Windows machine, so any of the Surface products, the Dell XPS 15, any of the sort of higher end, like the higher end laptops in that area, like the HP Spectre or whatever, all of those are going to have about similar life product cycles or like life lengths as a Mac is.
Well, you could only play devil's advocate for so long. I don't even have a Mac.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the one with a Mac, and I picked the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even have one. I was just trying to debate you, but you just like presented a treatise and then like took extra 1 AR time. So I don't know if I can defeat you on this. You're also probably right. PCs are probably just better.
Yeah, I mean,
I was just trying to think.
it's pretty clear.
I was just trying to think what other people might say. Anyway, people who are angry at us and just think that Macs are the best, send an angry email to the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com using either your real name or creating a fake funny account like Max Forever the Best Screw Lawrence at gmail.com or whatever. And just
I'll add
us
I'll add one more point in. It is hard to use Mac.
No more points. You made like 50 points. Come on.
Verbatim is much better on PC. I can't do debate work on Mac. It's so hard.
Nah, get out of here, Lawrence.
I think that's the nail in the coffin in a debate podcast.
That's true. And speaking of nails in coffins, stay frosty.